where we get into trouble. So that's where that grace to help in time of need is so important to us in addressing those things that we need in a way that will glorify God. So anyway, in verse 19, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. Now, there are a lot of fig trees around Israel, and in April they have green leaves and little edible buds on them. And so people could come along and they could pick these little buds off and eat them. But the fig trees didn't actually produce until they were 3 years old. So whatever the case, either this was too young of a tree or for some reason it just wasn't producing these edible buds. Jesus comes up to it, sees all these green leaves and thinks, man, I'm hungry. It's a normal thing as we're walking along the road to pick these buds off and eat them for a little snack. And he comes up and there's nothing. And he says to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. Now, you kind of get the picture that he says, may no fruit come to you again, and then you're just kind of watching like a CGI movie or something, and the fig tree just goes, and falls over and turns to dust, and then a fan comes on, of course, and then it blows the dust away, it's not there anymore. Actually, it was the next day, but Matthew is what he's emphasizing here is the immediacy of it. I mean, how many of you have come upon a healthy-looking tree one day, and then the next day, something that's completely dead and withered? It just doesn't happen unless you're me that sprays Roundup on a fruit tree instead of fruit spray, which I won't embarrass myself any further with what happened there. But so he says, May no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Now, this is actually one of the most misunderstood scriptures and portions of Jesus' life, I think, that is in the gospel. And what people have taken this to mean is, oh, God is basically telling me I have a blank check. I can say to God, do this, and as long as I have enough faith, then He's going to do it. And by have enough faith, people fill in the blank about, oh, I got to really kind of gin up this big emotional thing. I got to be really into it. If I pray loudly enough, if I use just the right words, if I have, the lights are low and the music is loud and repetitive, and I've got all these things in place so that my mind can really make it happen, then God's going to do it. And I can move. I've read accounts where people have claimed, oh, we stood up this radio station and there was a mountain in the way and we prayed and the mountain moved. And now we can have our radio, and all this kind of stuff. What we need to understand, and I think as I've explained to you over the last few weeks, that I teach the context. What's the context of what we're talking about here? The context is Jesus' hostile takeover, okay? The context is that he is putting the Jewish leaders on notice that their system, what they have done to it, has ruined it, and God's coming back to take over again. We're going to see that much more clearly as we make our way through the chapter. So if you look at this, what is essentially an acted-out parable in light of what Jesus is doing and saying to the religious leaders, it has a completely different idea. The Jewish religious system, as it existed then, is going to be like a huge mountain in opposition against the spread of the gospel. As we went through the book of Acts, we saw that very clearly. It was mainly Jewish opposition, the Jews that were holding on to a system of legalism that was keeping the gospel, trying to bottle it up, trying to get rid of it. But of course, the more they bottled it up, the more fizz there was on the inside, and the more it exploded out all over the place and got all over the walls, and everybody started getting saved, and they didn't know what was going on. So when Jesus talks about a mountain, when Jesus talks about praying with faith and it'll be done for you, He's talking about the creation of a new system, a new kingdom with a new king that's replacing the tainted one that the Jewish leaders were in charge of. He's not talking about having a blank check from God. He also wasn't mad at the fig tree, okay? The fig tree didn't do anything. You bad fig tree, you didn't produce fruit, and I was hungry, so be withered, boom, he kind of, fire falls from heaven and destroys it. No, the fig tree was a willing participant in an acted out parable of Jesus. This is actually not that uncommon. Back in Ezekiel chapter 4, Ezekiel did an acted out parable. Remember a parable story with an important spiritual point to it? And he had to build a model of Jerusalem, and then he poured a pot of water from one of the sides, and it represented the influx of an army coming, all this kind of stuff. So, they didn't have TV, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have special effects, all this kind of stuff. And so sometimes they would actually act out a little play, and they would show by this play a spiritual point that God was trying to make. So that's what this is. Now, Ezekiel couldn't speak to a fig tree and it would wither at once, but Jesus could, and so that's what takes place. And what he's saying here is this. The Jewish system as it existed then showed incredible promise. These great leaves, leafy green. Wow, these people had the temple and all this pomp and circumstance and the sacrifices and the priestly garments and this incredible show that was going on. A promise of great fruit, but none to be found when you got close, because what it had turned into was either a privileged sect that you got into by birth, or it was a system whereby you earned God's favor through your acts of righteousness. The acts of righteousness as they were given to you by the same religious leaders who themselves wouldn't do any of them. And it created a system of people that looked really good on the outside, but inside it was the same old garbage, the same old sin, the same old putrefaction that takes place when you have a sinful nature. But they had become insulated by this crust of fake righteousness from understanding their need for God and their search for a rescuer, which was what Jesus was doing. Coming in as a hostile takeover, but coming in on a rescue mission. He was coming to put the religious leaders on notice, but he was coming to bring peace and healing to the people that would cling to Him. So Israel was spiritually barren, just like this tree was. And not only did Jesus condemn the tree, He killed it. And in the same way, He is condemning and killing this religious system as it had been tainted by the religious leaders. So, when He says, if you have faith and do not doubt, if you say to this mountain, be taken up. One commentator actually suggested when he said this mountain, where he was there on the way to Jerusalem, he's actually looking at Jerusalem as a mountain. And using that as a metaphor for the system of religious hypocrisy that had been set in place, and that's going to be taken up and thrown into the sea. No more. It will be done away with. And in just a few short years, within one generation, that's literally what happened to the city itself. The Roman legions came in and they wiped out Jerusalem. They knocked it all down. They crucified thousands of people, and the Jews were forced to